So there's a lot of videos out there on YouTube and out there in the world, lots of explanations about what spatial dimensions are. And they pretty much agree for dimensions 1, 2, and 3. It's when you get to dimension 4 that there's a lot of variation in what is understood and how it's described, right? And so the postulate is that the fourth dimension is time, right? And so a lot of people with an understanding of physics would describe it as there's 3 spatial dimensions and 1 dimension of time. And if they're going deeper into string theory and such like, then there may be 10 or 11 dimensions. But they still keep time separate from the spatial dimensions. My theory and my precept is that time is not a dimension unto itself. That time is where the spatial dimensions apparently come out of. And I say apparently because I think that time has everything to do with perception. That without a perceiver there is no time. That time is, in its most simplest description, just the perception of change. So not change itself, but rather the perceiving of change is time. And what's been demonstrated through experiments with animals where they hook electrodes up to the animal in question that they're studying, and then they place them in front of a strobing light where they can moderate the frequency of the strobe. And what they found is that just like when you look at a fluorescent light, you know it's strobing, and you can kind of perceive the strobe if you move your head fast enough, or if it's a light that you can hold in your hand, you can wave it back and forth, and you can see those strobes. But if you're just staring at it, you don't, other than this kind of vaguely annoying feeling that we get when we're under fluorescent light. So you don't really perceive the flashes of light. It's in this constantly on state in our mind, even though it's actually flashing. And what they found in these experiments with animals, insects too, is that perception is not constant between animals. That smaller animals with higher metabolisms tend to the flashes need to be going much more rapidly in order for them to perceive it in a constant on state, the way we do with a fluorescent bulb. So a fly, for example, may actually distinctly perceive that flashing of the fluorescent that we do not. So what this tells me is that time is not constant. There is no constant when it comes to time. That is perceived in different ways by different organisms and different people. And it seems to the studies that I was reading about, they equated it with size. But I think it's more to do with metabolism, like how fast the life process of the organism is working. But even beyond that, even beyond metabolism, what's really the crucial element with how time is perceived or change is perceived is how quickly information is transferred between sensate cells. So it's kind of like how fast the refresh rate is. How many frames you get per second determines how you perceive time. It's like it's not so much that so let's say that Einstein's theory of relativity, at least the way that I understand it roughly, is about if we imagine time or the increments of time as as light posts on a street, all evenly spaced, and they disappear down the street into the horizon. And now by bending and curving that street, you can change the relationship of the posts together, and they can become further apart or closer together depending on the nature of the curves in the road. However, I think there's a whole different kind of relativity that has to do with the way that individuals perceive time. And it's like the same question is my red your red? You know, we both perceive this color that we call red, and we can both point to something red and agree that it's red, but how do I know that you're seeing the same red that I'm seeing? It's the same thing. It's like we can agree that a second has passed because we both saw the second hand click into its next position on the clock, but how much perceptual time occurred in that 1 second is going to be different for each individual and each organism. So I think the most concise way to put it is that time is expanded space, and space is condensed time. Those dimensions that we're attenuated to perceive objectively, we perceive as space. Things that we can only have an understanding of experientially, we perceive as time. In Edwin Abbey's book Flatland, he describes a race of people that only perceive and exist in two dimensions. And the only way that these two-dimensional people can perceive a three-dimensional object is if it is passed through the plane of their universe. And so what they would perceive if they were able to lift themselves out of their two-dimensional universe and see this still two-dimensional view of their universe from above, what they would perceive is a point. As they watch this sphere passing through the plane of their universe, they would see a point expanding into a circle and then contracting again into a point. But since they are two-dimensional and they can't lift themselves out of that universe, what they'd actually see is a dot that expanded into a line and then contracted back into a dot again. But they wouldn't even see that, because how would they perceive it without light bouncing off of the object? And if it has no thickness, if it only has length and width, then there's nothing for the light to bounce off of, so they wouldn't perceive anything at all. So as fun as it is to think about that cartoon that's presented in Flatland, and as useful as it is for understanding notions of dimension, spatial dimension, it is not at all accurate in understanding how organisms actually perceive spatial dimensions and time. But what is useful about it is this notion of the two-dimensional populace of that universe perceiving objects of a higher dimension as an experience. Since they cannot objectively understand the sphere, they still do have a phenomenal experience, but they can't view all of the points of information at the same time and put it together as a shape in their minds, because their minds can only conceive of shapes existing in two dimensions. They can't imagine layering or stacking those two-dimensional instances into a three-dimensional form. And I think the same can be said of fourth-dimensional objects to a three-dimensional perceiver. We can only experience a fourth-dimensional object as it passes through our plane of perception, our three-dimensional plane. If you go and look for examples of video of hyperforms on the internet, there's at least two good examples that come to mind. One, the Royal Society has one that's presented in the form of a lecture, and the speaker has a video where they show a computer animation of a hyperform. Again, like passing through the three-dimensional space. So what it appears to us is the representation of a three-dimensional object. They usually do these things as wireframes so that it's kind of easier to see. It's still very complicated, confusing to look at. It seems to be changing not only in size but also in shape, and then diminishing into nothing as it passes through our three-dimensional universe. We can only conceive of these fourth-dimensional forms as a three-dimensional experience. We can't hold all the perspectives and the facets of a hyperform because we don't have the capacity to hold all of the information and to view it simultaneously. But it's the corollary of seeing how there's a similarity in the way that a two-dimensional perceiver would perceive a three-dimensional form passing through their space, and how a three-dimensional perceiver can kind of get some notion of what a fourth-dimensional, a hypercube, or some other polytope, I believe is what they are called, higher dimensional object, how they could have some kind of phenomenological experience of it. So this is why I think that time is not actually a separate dimension. It's more like time-space is like a coin. And on one side you have space, and on the other side you have time. and they're both always present. Another analogy that I like to use is a ladder, and at the top of the ladder is say space, for example, and at the bottom is time. And as your perception evolves, you climb and grasp higher rungs of the ladder, and so these spatial dimensions appear to condense out of time, even though they were there all along. So this also has implications about how time changes as the perceptual awareness of higher spatial dimension changes. Time becomes less dense in essence, because what you perceived before as this changing phenomena, you're now able to view objectively as having a quote-unquote like kind of static relationship, a physical relationship to space. So, time is expanded space. Space is condensed time. I call this scalar relativity. It's a little bit awkward, but it describes exactly what I mean.